The EU has just rolled out an official preparedness strategy urging every household across its 27 member states to stockpile enough supplies to survive on their own for at least 72 hours. It's not just a recommendation, it's a coordinated push involving websites, school programs, and even plans for a national preparedness day. This sudden shift in tone comes shortly after US Vice President JD Vance's remarks in Greenland, where he called out Denmark for failing to defend the Arctic from foreign threats. The timing has raised eyebrows, and here lies the big question: is Europe on the brink of something bigger, or is this just fear-driven preparedness? The speech that sparked it all. It all began with a speech that barely lasted 10 minutes, but sent ripples through Europe's highest offices. During a visit to the Patuffik Space Base in northern Greenland, US Vice President JD Vance stood before a group of American military personnel and made a bold accusation. Denmark, the country responsible for Greenland's defense, had failed to invest in protecting one of the West's most strategically vital territories. He warned of increasing incursions by Russia and China, suggesting that Denmark's inaction was putting not only the Arctic, but all of Europe at risk. Greenland, often overlooked on global maps, is suddenly at the center of a geopolitical tug of war. Rich in rare earth minerals and positioned between North America and Europe, it's not just a frozen landmass, it's a front line. The US has maintained a presence there for decades, but Vance's speech signaled something new: open criticism of an ally, and a warning that the Arctic is no longer safe from the ambitions of global powers. Denmark's leadership responded quickly, calling the remarks unfair and deeply unhelpful. EU leaders echoed this sentiment, warning that the speech risked undermining NATO unity at a time when coordination is more important than ever. Behind the scenes, the tension was clear. America's tone had shifted from partnership to pressure. As media outlets replayed the speech and analysts dissected its implications, one phrase summed it up best: Greenland may be covered in ice, but the politics around it are heating up. The speech shook Europe. But how would the EU respond? Definitely not with weapons, but with something far more personal. Inside the EU's emergency strategy. Following Vice President Vance's speech and the growing unease across Europe, the European Union unveiled what it calls a common culture of preparedness. At the heart of this plan is a clear instruction: every household across the EU should have enough essential supplies to survive independently for at least 72 hours. Food, bottled water, a flashlight, a power bank, hygiene products, documents, and even some emergency cash. These are no longer optional in the eyes of Brussels. They are now part of a civilian defense mindset. But why 72 hours? Experts say this window is crucial. Psychologically, it's a manageable time frame for the average citizen. Not long enough to feel overwhelming, but long enough to bridge the gap before formal government aid or rescue operations can mobilize. Tactically, it reflects the reality that the first 3 days of any crisis, be it a blackout, flood, cyber attack, or even an act of war, are the most critical for survival and stability. The announcement was fronted by Hadja Labib, the EU Commissioner for Preparedness and Crisis Management. Her demonstration of her own emergency kit, complete with a Swiss Army knife, flashlight, waterproof documents, and power bank, quickly went viral. Social media lit up with people sharing what they'd include in their own kits. One quote from her speech stood out above all: "In the middle of crisis, cash is king, and a dead phone is a dead end." The message was simple but effective: don't wait for disaster, get ready now. The rollout isn't stopping with announcements. Several EU nations are planning awareness campaigns, school curriculum editions, and even the launch of an annual Preparedness Day. What was once considered paranoia is now policy. The EU doesn't just want governments to be ready, it wants its people ready too. A Europe on edge. Across Europe, the response to the EU's emergency plan has been swift and emotional. In cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Rome, shelves of canned food and bottled water began to empty within hours of the announcement. News footage showed long queues outside supermarkets, hardware stores running out of flashlights, and citizens clutching first aid kits and power banks. Panic buys quickly became trending headlines, and the mood shifted from calm curiosity to quiet urgency. Interviews on the street captured a range of emotions. Some expressed disbelief that such measures were even necessary. Others welcomed the clarity. One young father in Madrid said, "It's better to prepare and never need it than to need it and not be ready." Meanwhile, an elderly woman in Brussels recalled the food rationing during World War II. "I never thought I'd see anything like this again," she said, packing her small emergency bag, "but I understand why." The moment also drew powerful comparisons to the Cold War. Back then, families built bunkers and rehearsed air raid drills. Today, the focus is more on cyber threats, power outages, and infrastructure collapse. But the fear feels oddly familiar. The same instinct to protect, to brace for the unknown, still drives people to take action. One particularly moving story came from a family in rural France. With their children, they spent the weekend assembling their kit, treating it as both a learning activity and a bonding experience. "We don't want to scare them," the mother said, "but we want them to understand that being ready is smart, not scary." It's a sentiment that echoes throughout the continent, a sense that while the threats may be modern, the human response remains timeless. Why Greenland matters more than ever. As climate change melts the Arctic ice, new sea routes are opening, shorter, faster pathways for global trade that bypass traditional choke points. At the same time, Greenland's vast deposits of rare earth minerals, essential for everything from smartphones to military technology, have become a hot commodity in the race for strategic resources. This shift has drawn attention from the world's biggest players. The United States has long maintained a military presence at the Patuxent space base, using it as a key outpost for satellite tracking and missile defense. But now, Russia and China are increasing their influence in the region, Russia through military exercises and polar expansion, and China through investments, infrastructure offers, and even proposals to build research stations. The EU too is paying attention. With the Arctic becoming more accessible, the bloc sees both opportunity and risk. Greenland's location makes it ideal for surveillance and early warning systems. Whoever controls this frozen frontier can monitor North Atlantic activity, influence shipping lanes, and secure mineral access for the future. If you were to look at a satellite map, the reason becomes clear. Greenland sits between North America and Europe, perfectly placed for both trade and defense. It's no longer just a landmass covered in ice. It's a strategic pivot point in the next chapter of global geopolitics. And that's exactly why a single speech about Greenland could send the entire European Union into prep mode. Cracks in NATO or a shift in the world order? JD Vance's blunt remarks in Greenland didn't just highlight tensions with Denmark, they exposed a growing rift between the United States and its European allies. To some within the EU, his words felt less like constructive criticism and more like public humiliation. Many saw it as a signal that Washington is willing to call out allies on defense failures, even at the risk of unity within NATO. This incident has sparked uncomfortable conversations across Europe. For decades, European security rested on the assumption that the US would always be the ultimate shield. Now, that assumption is starting to crack. With rising American skepticism over NATO spending and shifting global priorities, European leaders are realizing they may need to take more responsibility for their own defense, sooner rather than later. This shift is already in motion. Sweden, for example, has announced plans to increase its defense spending to 3.5% of its GDP, far above NATO's 2% guideline. It's a clear message. Europe is preparing to stand more independently. Across the continent, similar conversations are happening in defense ministries and parliaments, with budgets being re-evaluated and strategies rewritten. The old world order, where the US leads and Europe follows, is changing, and while NATO remains intact on paper, the dynamics within the alliance are evolving fast. Whether this is just a rough patch or the start of a long-term reset, one thing is certain: Europe is waking up to the idea that it may soon need to protect itself, with or without American backing. Preparedness or paranoia? Not everyone agrees with the EU's push for household emergency kits. Critics argue that urging millions to stockpile food and water sends the wrong message, that it breeds unnecessary fear and risks pushing society toward survivalist thinking. They question whether the threat level truly justifies the tone of the warnings and suggest that governments might be using crisis talk as a distraction from political failures. On the other side of the debate, many experts insist the warnings are not only justified, they're overdue. The modern world faces complex, overlapping threats, cyber attacks on infrastructure, extreme climate events, and the lingering shadow of war on Europe's eastern edge. In this context, they argue, being unprepared is not just risky, it's irresponsible. The scars from COVID-19 also run deep. In 2020, much of Europe found itself scrambling for basic supplies, emergency protocols, and public trust. That collective memory remains fresh, and it's fueling a new mindset. To many, the 72-hour kit is not a sign of fear. It's a sign of learning from the past. This tension between caution and alarmism runs throughout the public conversation. For some, prepping feels like taking control. For others, it feels like giving in to fear. But regardless of where people stand, the EU's message is clear. Hope for the best, but be ready for the worst. A ready Europe. What began as an emergency guideline is slowly becoming part of everyday life. Across the EU, preparedness is no longer just a government directive, it's evolving into a cultural shift. Schools are starting to introduce basic crisis readiness into their curriculum. Governments are planning a continent-wide preparedness day to normalize the idea of being ready. Even emergency apps are being promoted, offering real-time alerts and checklists for households. For many families, the concept of prepping has gone from anxiety-inducing to empowering. One family in Austria began building their 72-hour kit together, turning it into a weekend project. It started with fear, the father admitted, but it ended up bringing us closer. We talked about real things, what matters most, what we do in an emergency. It was the first time we really had that conversation as a family. That kind of mindset shift is becoming more common. People are starting to see preparedness not as paranoia, but as peace of mind. The kits aren't just physical, they're mental. They represent readiness, control, and resilience in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. War may never come. The power might never go out. The skies may stay clear, but Europe is preparing like it might. And perhaps, in a world full of uncertainty, that's the smartest move of all.